Plato's dialogue, the Meno, is a fascinating dialogue looking at not just epistemological questions as to one can ever know anything at all or how it's possible to come to know things. It doesn't just look at metaphysics in terms of what is virtue, what is the nature. In many ways, the question, what is virtue, lends oneself to start thinking in certain ways about how virtue might be known, if it is possible to be known, based on its nature. So we might say, for example, well, if something is immaterial, let's say the mind is immaterial, and virtue is something material, how could one ever come to know what that is, which is material, if its nature is the opposite of that which is knowing, the mind, if the mind is immaterial? Or how might, in the reverse, someone who is immortal come to know something which is immaterial? But it's also a dialogue that concerns ethics, as is the question, what is virtue? It's not just a metaphysical question, but a meta-ethical question, which also borders on normative ethics of what it means to be a good person in relation to thinking about what the nature of virtue is and how we might come to know whether it's possible we can know what virtue is. So that's what this dialogue is going to look at, as well as being famous for the theory of recollection, which I'll touch upon. Before I begin the actual dialogue, I do want to mention that it's really important to have some sense of who the characters are in the dialogue. Anyone that would have been Plato's contemporary would have known who the characters are. All the characters are based on real people. Meno, being the main interlocutor with Socrates in this dialogue, is someone who is described by Xenophon in his Anabasis as being disreputable, ambitious, someone who's very dishonest, youthful, and you can see, when he lived from roughly 423 BCE to 400, that's only, dying when he's 23 years old. So he lived a relatively short life. To what extent we might want to associate his youthfulness with being disreputable, ambitious, and dishonest. But also this other line that Xenophon criticizes Meno as being willing to commit any injustice for advancement and immeasurably greedy for wealth. Now, I need to mention, of course, that sources differ a bit as to whether this description is entirely accurate. Perhaps he was somewhat dishonest or, very ambitious, and so did some terrible things. In fact, he did lead armies. So maybe he wasn't as terrible as Xenophon paints him, but it's likely that many Athenians would have known about this reputation that Meno had. And it's likely then that they would be reading this dialogue with the context of knowing the history and the character of Meno. So the dialogue begins with Meno mentioning that he is a fan of Gorgias. He learns from Gorgias. Gorgias is able to, as Gorgias claims, teach Meno what virtue is. And Socrates is unsure whether one actually can learn virtue or not, in terms of whether it's something teachable, like an art or a craft might be, in the same way that we might talk about having an apprenticeship or learning how to play a game or anything like that involves, the more of the Greek term techne, right? An art, a skill in that way. But since Meno has been associating with Gorgias and claims that Gorgias is teaching him what virtue is, how to be virtuous, Socrates asks him, what then is virtue? And Meno gives an answer such that, the virtue of a man is to manage public affairs, such that one benefits their friends and harms their enemies, preventing harm to themselves. The virtue, then, of a woman is managing the home well, preserving its possessions, and being submissive to her husband. And then the virtue of a child or an elderly person, a slave, and so on is different. So each person, a man, a woman, a child, right? All these different classes, a slave and so on, they all have different virtues. And Meno is able to explain what each of those virtues are. We can also see that these virtues are probably mirroring the dominant virtues of Athenian society, what is more or less commonly accepted as being the virtues, right? So Meno is in a way regurgitating the dominant views of Athenian and the larger Greek society. But Socrates, like in many other dialogues, basically responds to Meno saying, you haven't actually explained to me what virtue is. You haven't given me the essence. You haven't given a definition or explained the nature of virtue. You've given examples of virtue. He says, I am asking whether you think it is only in the case of virtue that there is one for man, another for woman, and so on. Or is the same true in the case of health and size and strength? Do you think that there is one health for a man and another for woman? Or if it is health, does it have the same form everywhere, whether in man or in anything else, whatever? So in the same way we might talk about, well, we can say that to be healthy might consist in, being hydrated, exercising well, and so on, such that we can give a general description that then all human beings would try to be healthy according to that definition. Is virtue like that, or are there particular ways in which, there is no one thing that is virtue, but there are virtues in the plural, as opposed to when we think about the definition or the nature of health for a human being? So I want to read further here. He says, Meno responding to this question, I think, Socrates, that somehow this is no longer like those other cases. How so, Socrates says? Did you not say that virtue of a man consists of managing the city well, and that of a woman of managing the household? I did, Meno replies. So Socrates says, is it possible to manage a city well, or a household, or anything else, while not managing it moderately and justly? Certainly not, replies Meno. Then if they manage justly and moderately, they must do so with justice and moderation. Necessarily, Meno says. So both the man and the woman, if they are to be good, need the same things, justice and moderation. So it seems. What about a child and an old man? Can they possibly be good if they are intemperate and unjust? Certainly not. But if they are moderate and just, yes. So all human beings are good in the same way, for they become good by acquiring the same qualities. It seems so. And they would not be good in the same way if they did not have the same virtue. They certainly would not be, Meno replies. Since then, the virtue of all is the same. Try to tell me and to remember what Gorgias, and you with him, said that the same thing is. Okay. So Meno gives a second definition, or perhaps a first attempt at a real definition of virtue, if the former accounts given were just, a preliminary definition. But basically Meno says, okay, I can tell you what virtue is, Socrates. Virtue is the ability to rule. Now, Socrates responds, great. But let me ask further to understand your definition. Does it mean the ability to rule justly or unjustly? Does it matter whether one rules justly, or is it just about a matter of utility? Then we might also ask, is virtue, is the ability to rule virtue itself, or is it a virtue, meaning that you can have the ability to rule being a virtue, and we might think about this also in terms of prudence, ruling one's own, body, one's own emotions, being in control of oneself through the use of reason, or of course rule politically. We might also think, well, is it a virtue in the same way that courage or moderation, wisdom are different virtues? Or, of course, is the ability to rule virtue itself, such that, courage is just one instance of virtue, moderation another instance of virtue, such that, well, courage is the ability to rule in a certain way, moderation is the ability to rule in a different way, and so on. clearly we can see then there are some problems with this account of virtue being the ability to rule, because it seems more like it is a virtue and not virtue itself, not the nature, the essence of virtue, such that all the other virtues, of course, are explained or fit within that definition. So Meno offers a third definition. Virtue is to desire beautiful things and have the power to acquire them. So notice a bit of the dialectic here. We've already got the Socratic method, Vilenkus, occurring here, where Socrates is asking questions that get Meno to further articulate that which they are after, which is the question, what is virtue? But we also have a kind of moving beyond this, of course, second definition, that virtue is the ability to rule, and yet retaining some aspect of it, such that in the third definition, when Meno says virtue is to desire beautiful things and have the power to acquire them. So we still have that aspect of ruling within the third definition here. It's not just good enough to desire beautiful things, but to be virtuous, right? There's this kind of ability to realize that which you desire as well. So let me read here further in the dialogue. Okay. All right. So Meno says, I think, Socrates, that virtue is, as the poet says, to find joy in beautiful things and have power. So I say that virtue is to desire beautiful things and have the power to acquire them. So Socrates asks, do you mean that the man who desires beautiful things desires good things? Most certainly, Meno says. Do you assume that there are people who desire bad things and others who desire good things? Do you not think, my good man, that all men desire good things? I do not, Meno says. But some desire bad things. Yes, and here we might want to start thinking on, right, the story, the character that Athenians might know of Meno. Do you mean that they believe the bad things to be good, or that they know they are bad and nevertheless desire them? I think there are both kinds, Meno says. Do you think, Meno, that anyone knowing that bad things are bad nevertheless desires them? So it's not just that one desires bad things, mistaking them to be good things. But now Meno is saying that some people know that a bad thing is bad and still desire them. So Socrates asks, what do you mean by desiring? Is it to secure for oneself? And Meno says, well, what else would it be but to make that thing one's possession, to own it? Does he think that the bad things benefit him who possesses them, or does he know they harm him, right? Because, well, we would think, what is, what's the definition of something bad? Something harmful. So if one desires bad things, they desire things which harm themselves, is what Socrates here is implying. And Meno says, there are some who believe that the bad things benefit them, others that the bad things harm them. Do you think that there are those who believe that bad things benefit them, know that they are bad? And Meno says, no, that I cannot altogether believe. That they cannot, those who believe that bad things benefit them, know that they are bad. No. So they have to, in that instance, it seems, think they're good. So Socrates says, it's clear then that those who do not know things to be bad do not desire what is bad, but they desire those things that they believe to be good, but that are in fact bad. It follows that those who have no knowledge of these things and believe them to be good clearly desire good things. Is that not so? It's likely, Meno says. Well then, those who you say desire bad things, believing that bad things harm their possessor, know that they will be harmed by them. Necessarily, Meno now says. So now he's admitted, well, actually, if someone knows something is going to harm them, then they're not going to desire it. And if something harmful is something bad, then people aren't going to knowingly desire bad things. We want to think, well, okay, but what about the instance of Meno? Meno desired, he was willing to do terrible things. He was willing to act unjustly to secure what he desired through his, right, what his ambitions were. He carried them out no matter what the story goes. Does the actual historical fact of Meno contradict the argument that's being made here by Socrates and Meno, that one does not knowingly desire bad things? Or might it be the case that Meno desires good things, but it turns out he doesn't fully understand what those good things are? Might it just be that he is uneducated because he's young and rash? Might it be the case that he is manipulated, or Gorgias is teaching him the wrong things? Or maybe Gorgias is also teaching him the wrong things because Meno is young and impressionable. All right, some things to think about. How do we make sense of this this claim that those who desire bad things do so from a lack of knowledge? This then leads Socrates to reformulate Meno's previous definition of knowledge. And Socrates says, well, now what do you think about this definition? That virtue is the power of securing good things. So it's not just securing what one desires, but it's the power of securing good things. So what then are good things? He asks Meno. And Meno says, well, health, wealth, gold and silver, honors, and offices in the city. All things of this kind are good things. Now, of course, Meno has not given a definition of what good things are or what the good is, but merely he's given examples. And it's notable he's given the kinds of examples that Meno himself was interested in. The kind of examples that probably dominated Athenian society, Greek society, in thinking, this is what one should desire. This is what makes a life well lived, is if you have good health. You have lots of wealth. You have honors, in terms of, political honors, ruling, winning battles, and so on. So in certain ways, we should see the way that Socrates is asking these questions to Meno. What he's getting in return are kind of the responses that are emblematic of many typical people in Athenian and the larger Greek society. And we can also then probably, asking that question, guess what many people might say now are good things, based on what people, it seems, try to pursue. Now, of course, the question, though, is whether those really are good things or not. Whether that which is a good thing is a good in and of itself, or there can be things which are good things which are equally as good as those which are intrinsically good. So they might have external qualities of goodness that makes them good insofar as that we recognize them and desire them. But with this definition of virtue being the power of securing good things, Socrates asks Meno, is it virtuous to acquire good things unjustly or without moderation and so on? Such that, well, can we say that it would be good to acquire something without acting justly? And we all would say, well, justice is a kind of virtue. What virtue exactly is justice? That this dialogue doesn't explicitly tackle that question. But we can see the point Socrates is getting at is that, okay, we can say when one is virtuous, they seek good things. And by being virtuous, they know how to secure those good things. But that doesn't mean then they abandon the other virtues. All of the virtues, then, it would seem, at least what's implied by Socrates' questioning, must be had simultaneously. That one cannot be virtuous without acting with all of the virtues in harmony. Such that it can't just be the case that one knows what courage is and can act courageously, but can't act moderately, or can't act with the virtue of temperance, and so on. So the question is, are these things that Meno has listed virtue itself or a part of virtue? And what Socrates wants to say is, well, it seems like they're more a part of virtue. Why? Assuming they are virtuous, right? So what Socrates is going to do is he's going to cede a little ground to Meno in order to kind of get Meno to come from his perspective, to see what Socrates, through this questioning, is trying to get him to realize. And if you recognize that these different kinds of things that Meno has said are good things are just parts of virtue and not virtue itself, then we can't just know why or how to pursue health, wealth, and so on. We have to still question. We have to still understand what virtue is. Because it might also reflect on whether those things are truly good or not. At this point, Meno provides a kind of rebuttal to the kind of questioning that Socrates is getting at, wanting to know what virtue is. And we start turning to whether virtue can be known or not. And Meno basically asks, well, how can one inquire into the nature of virtue if one doesn't already know what virtue is? It's like asking someone to go and in a parking lot look for my car. Well, how are you going to look for my car if you don't already know what my car is? So the paradox basically is that no one can logically inquire productively into what one does not already know, nor into what one already does. So basically, if you don't know what virtue is, well, it doesn't seem like you can inquire into it at all because you don't know what you're going to be looking for. And if you do know what virtue is, then you're not going to inquire into it because you already possess virtue. You already know exactly what it is. There's no inquiry required. So it seems that one can't ever come to have knowledge of anything, much less virtue. So in logical form, the paradox works like this. The first premise says, for anything F, either one knows F or one does not know F. If one knows F, then one cannot inquire about F. If one does not know F, then one cannot inquire about F. Therefore, for all F, one cannot inquire about F. So Socrates responds to this paradox with what is known as the theory of recollection, but it's presented in the form of mythos, a kind of narrative or a story. It's not presented as an actual, airtight theory or anything like that. Basically, the theory of recollection says that, well, the soul is immortal, and it's of the same nature then, immortal and immaterial of, what the same nature of knowledge as well, what we want to inquire into, what we want to come to possess. And this theory explains how it's possible then to get around the paradox, how it's possible to have knowledge of virtue. Okay, so here is the theory of recollection. So Socrates says that the argument, Meno's paradox, does not seem sound to him. Meno asks, can you tell me why? So Socrates says, I can. I have heard wise men and women talk about divine matters. What did they say? Meno asks. What was, I thought, both true and beautiful? What was it, and who were they? So notice, what Socrates is going to articulate here is not anything that comes from himself. He is re-articulating what he claims he has heard from other people, wise people, both men and women. He says, the speakers were among the priests and priestesses, whose care it is to be able to give an account of their practices. Pindar, too, says it, and many others of the divine among our poets. What they say is this: see whether you think they speak the truth. They say that the human soul is immortal. At times it comes to an end, which they call dying. At times it is reborn, but it is never destroyed, and one must therefore live one's life as piously as possible. Persephone will return to the sun above in the 9th year, the souls of those from whom she will exact punishment for old miseries. And from these come noble kings, mighty in strength and greatest in wisdom, and for the rest of time men will call them sacred heroes. As the soul is immortal, has been born often, and has seen all things, here and in the underworld, there is nothing which it has not learned. So it is in no way surprising that it can recollect the things it knew before, both about virtue and other things, as the whole of nature is akin. And the soul has learned everything. Nothing prevents a man, after recalling one thing only, a process men call learning, discovering everything else for himself, if he is brave and does not tire of the search. For searching and learning are, as a whole, recollection. We must therefore not believe that debater's argument, for it would make us idle, and faint-hearted men like to hear it, whereas my argument makes them energetic and keen on the search. I think we should reread that real quick. We must not believe that debater's argument, the sophist's argument, for it would make us idle, and faint-hearted men like to hear it, whereas my argument makes them energetic and keen on the search. It's motivational. I trust that this is true, and I want to inquire along with you into the nature of virtue. Yes, Socrates, but how do you mean that we do not learn, but that what we call learning is recollection? Can you teach me that this is so? So, this is where it gets interesting. Well, it's already interesting, of course. But now Socrates is going to demonstrate the theory of recollection. So, Socrates calls forth one of Meno's slaves. He asks the slave what the area of a square is doubled. Now, the slave does not know this. The slave doesn't have any kind of mathematical education which would allow the slave to articulate this when being asked immediately by Socrates. What Socrates wants to show is that the slave does actually possess knowledge of what the area of a square is doubled. All the slave has to do is recollect it. How is this recollection possible? Well, Socrates is going to do this through his Socratic method of questioning. And so basically what happens is Socrates kind of draws lines in the sand, draws a square, says, okay, imagine the square has 2 feet on each side. How are you able to figure out what the area of the square is doubled? And Meno basically says, well, maybe then we just double the square such that on each side it's 4 feet instead of 2 feet. Well, that's not actually the correct area of the square doubled if the square is 2 by 2 feet. The slave says, okay, well, maybe we just make it 3 feet instead of 2. Well, that also doesn't work. The slave seems stumped, is unclear what to do, realizes the slave doesn't know. At this point, Socrates has unburdened the slave, has done away with any kind of dogmatic presuppositions the slave might have about how to come to know the truth of what a square is doubled. And now the slave is ready to recollect. The slave is cleared, has undergone a clearing in a sense, a clearing of the soul. So through questioning, Socrates gets the slave to basically quadruple, so to draw out 4 squares, and then at the middle point of each of the big square now in each line, draw a square within it, diagonally. That diagonal square within the larger square that has been quadrupled, that is the area of a square doubled. The slave has been able to recollect, to explain, to possess knowledge, to articulate what a square is doubled without being told how to figure it out, only by being questioned by Socrates. So in argumentative form, what has actually just occurred? In argumentative form, this is what has occurred. This is how the theory of recollection is said to work. So premise 1, either the slave boy acquires knowledge or has always had it. Number 2, premise 2, if the slave boy has acquired it, then he has done so in a previous life, since he has not been educated in this one. Premise 3, knowledge was acquired when he was not in human shape. Premise 4, given the slave boy example, true opinions then must be transferred into knowledge. Premise 5, if premise 4 is true that true opinions must be transferred into knowledge, then the soul has always been in a state of knowledge. The conclusion, therefore, if premise 5 is correct, then the soul is immortal. So, how does recollection work? Does mere acquaintance with something mean that we know it, though? Because, again, we might want to say, well, I've been acquainted with, someone else, Oscar, that I've met before. But do I really know Oscar? If someone, asked me to explain the character of Oscar, could I really do that if I've just maybe met Oscar once? Probably not. how do we try to relate that to knowing certain other mathematical or moral truths? Does it kind of work the same? It seems a little bit ambiguous. And we might also want to think about the senses and how acquaintance works. When we see something maybe once or twice, just because we've seen something doesn't mean we know it. It seems like what's required is an articulation of the how, of the process. It's not just, of course, a matter of one's opinion being true, but one has to be able to justify that one's opinion is true. They have to justify why they know it. It's not clear exactly how the theory of recollection can justify that one knows these eternal truths. It seems like it has to assume things like, for example, with the case of premise 2, perhaps, we also might want to, just setting aside the abstract argumentation here as to how to make sense of the theory of recollection, we might want to look at some of the political implications of what Socrates has just done in this dialogue. He has taken a slave boy in Athenian society. I mean, Aristotle argues there are people who are by nature slaves. That is why they are justified in being enslaved. And yet what Socrates has just done is taken someone who is enslaved and had them produce a kind of knowledge that Meno does not possess, for example. Is that a kind of radical critique of class society and slavery in Athenian society? Who knows? I also should mention that with the theory of recollection, Plato is often thought of as being kind of the first rationalist in the Western tradition, or at least giving one of the first rationalist arguments. Rationalism being the epistemological theory that the primary source of knowledge is obtained through the use of reason or the mind alone. Is this really Plato's view? The dialogue is a matter of characters. Socrates is skilled. None of these dialogues are actual historical interactions that have occurred. Plato is crafting these dialogues for certain reasons. Plato is only mentioned in 2 different dialogues: the Apology, which it's claimed that he's sick and couldn't be there, and then as well in the Phaedo. So Plato isn't really even explicitly in the dialogues. So is what we're reading really Plato's own views that he's trying to articulate? Or is there something more pedagogical that the dialogues are meant to perform, a more pedagogical role? These are all questions that need to be considered. So, in closing out the dialogue of the Meno, in thinking about this theory of recollection, Socrates tries to articulate a kind of method that might be useful if one wants to utilize the theory of recollection. It's basically known as the method of hypothesis. So the method of hypothesis works by just you assume something, right? You assume X is the case, that maybe virtue is ruling well, and you see what follows. Now, it will be true, but only given our original assumptions. It will be true if we assume X is true. We, of course, then have to further prove that X is in fact true. And we can see this in certain kinds of examples, like how, well, if virtue is not knowledge, it can't be taught, Socrates wants to claim. If virtue is a good, and if knowledge is also a good, then goodness will be knowledge. So now we're starting to link together virtues, ethics, and the good, ontology, metaphysics, the nature of existence. If virtue is a good, then it will benefit us. Examples of this given: health, strength, beauty, and wealth. However, these things can be used badly. It can't just be the case that health is good in itself, strength is good in itself, beauty or wealth are good in themselves, because we can see all kinds of ways that wealth can be used to grasp power and rule unjustly through one's wealth, the way that beauty can be used to manipulate others, of course the way that strength can be used to commit unjust deeds, and so on. So what is required is, Socrates claims, the necessity of wisdom. One has to know, and this goes back to the justification required, and not just true opinion equaling knowledge, but one being able to justify why their opinion is true. If the soul is directed by wisdom, then the claim is things end in happiness. And we can liken wisdom, I think, as well to the virtue of prudence, of a kind of mastery of reason being able to master the body. So really just self-mastery is prudence. Now again, there have been certain assumptions that Socrates has made in claiming that wisdom is required in order to live virtuously. So it's not just enough that one can see what virtue is. It's not just enough that one can have examples of virtuous people. It's not enough that one can be given a theory of virtue. One has to themselves know what virtue is. And one develops knowledge of virtue through becoming wise. So one cannot become a good person without also becoming a wise person. Right? The connection then of knowledge and virtue here. But again, there are certain assumptions that Socrates has made in these claims. It's for the reader to try and parse out whether it is in fact true or not. Finally, the dialogue does end in aporia, in impasse. This is because if virtue is beneficial, Socrates claims it must be a form of wisdom, because such that is not good by nature. If knowledge is virtue, though, there should be teachers of it. If there are no teachers, then it is not a form of knowledge, because, well, teachers are professors of knowledge, professors of wisdom. Right? So we're going full circle to the question, is virtue teachable? And we think of teachers like physicians, like shoemakers taking on apprentices, like the sophists, like teachers in an educational setting in the modern world. Are sophists teachers? Do they have this form of knowledge? Socrates is trying to claim, no, they don't. But even if, though, there are no teachers of virtue, there are, it seems, virtuous people. How is it possible that there are virtuous people? And here we return to mythos. Anytus suggests that it comes from the gods. Now, why might he be suggesting this? Why might Plato be writing that Anytus suggests this? Could this be to motivate Meno, or really readers of the dialogue, since Meno is dead, he's too far gone, readers of the dialogue to not end in a negative way, because the dialogue ends in aporia, but positively, to be encouraged on to continue the philosophical pursuit of seeking wisdom. So Socrates says, virtue appears to be present in those of us who may possess it as a gift from the gods. We shall have clear knowledge of this when, before we investigate how it comes to be present in men, we first try to find out what virtue in itself is. So, if virtue is a divine gift, then why try to be good? Because it seems it's through no fault or no action of oneself that one comes to be virtuous. It's just determined by fate. The problem, though, is we can't answer any of this until we know what virtue is, and we still don't know what virtue is.